Go for it.
Hello, everyone. Allow me to ask you a question before I start. If you've heard of any one of the three bands I'm about to mention, please raise your hand. Radiohead, Coldplay, or Blur? Okay. Now, raise your hand if you've heard of the band Oasis. Exactly my point, less than half the class. What if I told you that all three bands I just named were inspired by this one band, and there's a good chance, well, as I've just seen, that you may not even have heard of them? Pretty cool. But before I talk more about the band, I think I should probably introduce you to them. And just for the sake of your convenience, I've highlighted all the important information you need to read in red, which, as you can see on the slide, just explains that I'm going to show you a video of the band.
Even though this band has taken their final vows, don't look back in anger. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're taking a look at the history of Oasis. Rock band Oasis formed in 1991 in Manchester, England. The group originated from another band called The Rain and was comprised of guitarist Paul Arthurs, bassist Paul McGuigan, drummer Tony McCarroll, and vocalist Liam Gallagher. The lineup was solidified later that year when Noel Gallagher came on as the band's leader and main guitarist, while Arthurs took over rhythm guitar. Oasis spent the next few months playing shows and recording a demo. They were then discovered by the co-founder of Creation Records, Alan McGee, in 1993. Their debut, Definitely Maybe, dropped the next year. Thanks to several successful singles such as Supersonic and Live Forever, the critically acclaimed rock disc went to #1 in the UK and found commercial success in the States. The subsequent live dates were fraught with tensions between the Gallagher brothers, and this sibling rivalry became a continuous source of media fodder throughout the band's existence. Following lineup changes that included McCarroll's replacement by Alan White, Oasis released their second album in 1995.
While the band was around for much longer, they actually lasted until 2009, and I cut it off at 1995. That's kind of the period I want to talk about, actually 1996. So, as you heard them mention in the video, the band became huge in the UK. At one point, they were considered like the next coming of the Beatles, and I know it may not, seem like that right away, but their role on music in the UK in general was so massive that they actually got their own music genre dedicated just to them alone, called Britpop, which you actually may have heard of, and the bands I mentioned earlier were all Britpop bands. But next I'm going to go on to my thesis. Despite Oasis's huge following in Europe, Asia, and South America, they never were able to break out in the US. We can look at a number of reasons of why this happened, but I think what I'm going to be talking about is that the American rock scene in the 90s was so dynamic that they never had the chance to get their Britpop sound into the mainstream. And also, there were two specific incidents I'm going to talk about that really hurt the band's chances of ever becoming the real deal in the US. But before I go any further, why should you care about some random British band in the 90s? Because if you listen to any British band now, or Irish musician, such as Ed Sheeran or the Arctic Monkeys, they were influenced by Oasis. So many musicians were influenced by them, and I think it's just funny how most people don't know anything about them. But next, I'm going to go over what I'm going to be talking about. As I mentioned, the rock scene in the 90s, the bigger than the Beatles comment they made, and Liam Gallagher, the lead singer's decision to abandon the band on their 1996 American tour. But first, let's talk about grunge. Grunge, I'm sure many of you have heard of, is otherwise known as the Seattle sound, it was basically a combination of punk and rock. But with certain effects, they were able to create a noise that had never been heard of before, and some of the few bands that you may have heard of that were grunge artists were Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden. I'm going to quickly go through these because these really aren't that important. Next is nu metal. Nu metal, just like grunge, was a heavier form of rock, of alternative rock, which obviously featured more elements of metal that you would normally not hear. This actually died out very quickly, but it took long enough where Oasis never got their chance, and a few notable nu metal artists were Rage Against the Machine, Linkin Park, and System of a Down. And finally, I'm going to talk about rap rock. Rap rock is pretty self-explanatory. It's rock with a rap influence in the background. And again, a few artists were the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Gorillaz, and the Beastie Boys. But now I want to go to a specific incident that really was the beginning of the end for the band in the United States, and that is their bigger than the Beatles comment. Paul McCartney, when asked about this incident, well, the incident was they were interviewed in around 1996, and Noel Gallagher told Q Magazine that the band was the next coming of Oasis and that they were going to be bigger than, the next coming of the Beatles, excuse me, and they were going to end up being bigger than the Beatles. And while it seems like a minor comment nowadays with everyone making outrageous hot takes, this was a pretty big deal because if you're claiming to be bigger than the best bands ever, you better back it up. And unfortunately, they never were able to for a number of other reasons. And when asked about it, Paul McCartney told Q Magazine, "I thought the biggest mistake they made was when they said, 'We're going to be bigger than the Beatles.' I thought, so many people have said that, and it's the kiss of death. Be bigger than the Beatles, but don't say it. The minute you say it, everything you do from then on is going to be looked at in the light of that statement." And as I mentioned before, the band was forever stuck in the shadow of the Beatles. Now their goal wasn't to be Oasis, it was to be the next Beatles. And that hurt them. And this incident, in my opinion, was by far the biggest detriment to the band's history in the US, was lead singer Liam Gallagher deciding to leave 15 minutes before the band was set to depart on their 1996 US tour. And notice how the statement that was mentioned earlier and this incident occurred in the same year. This was right after they released What's the Story, Morning Glory, which was their most commercially successful album. And you can see by record sales, the next album, Be Here Now, dropped by almost 12 million sales in the United States alone. And I believe that if we contribute this with the last point made, bless you, Hobbs, that we can really look and understand why everything went wrong. And I'm going to wrap this up now because I'm probably running super short on time. As we talked about, the rock scene of the 1990s really hurt the band, never giving them their opportunity to slide into the mainstream. The bigger than the Beatles comment really put them in the shadow of a band they were never going to pass. And Liam Gallagher deciding to go house hunting with his fiancée at the time, one of his many fiancées at the time, rather than going on an American tour, which could have easily put the band into the mainstream forever, was ultimately the downfall of the band in the US. It doesn't matter how big you are as a musician. Look at bands like the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, all British bands that came to the United States and became massive. And I feel like when we look at Oasis, they're considered one of the best bands ever by many people, but because they never made it in the US, there's always going to kind of be an asterisk next to their name, saying that they never were able to make it. And I just find that extremely interesting. But when you think of Oasis nowadays, the only song you probably know is Wonderwall, which has become a meme essentially. But if you're looking for something new to listen, may I point to definitely maybe or What's the Story, Morning Glory. You might just be surprised at what you guys find. Thank you.